Suffering is not an enemy. It is not a mistake. It is not something life does to you. It is life calling you to wake up. Look around you. Everyone you meet carries a hidden weight. Some suffer in silence, their eyes revealing a world of pain they never speak of. Others fight loudly, resisting, struggling, demanding answers from a universe that remains silent. But suffering is not a punishment. It is a doorway. A man loses everything, his job, his home, his family. At first he drowns in grief, in anger. He screams at the sky, blaming life, blaming himself. But when he is too exhausted to fight, when his mind stops running in circles, something shifts. In that silence he discovers a truth that was always there. He was never truly free, only distracted. The identity he had built, the things he had attached himself to, none of it was truly him, and in the destruction of the old, something new emerges. He begins to see life not as it was supposed to be, but as it is. That moment, painful as it was, became his awakening. A woman sits alone in a hospital room staring at a diagnosis she never thought she would face. The world around her moves on, but her world has stopped. The plans, the worries, the small irritations of yesterday, none of them matter now. And yet, in the midst of this crisis, she feels something unexpected, a stillness, a clarity. The laughter of a child in the hallway becomes the most beautiful sound she has ever heard. The touch of a loved one's hand, the most profound gift. The life she once took for granted now feels sacred. Her suffering has not taken life away from her. It has revealed it to her. Suffering strips away illusion. It forces us to stop pretending. It brings us face to face with what is real, with what has always been real. You may try to escape it, numb it, resist it, but resistance only deepens the pain. The moment you stop running, the moment you turn and face it, something remarkable happens. You discover that suffering is not here to destroy you, it is here to transform you. Have you ever seen a seed break open? It is shattered, split apart in the darkness of the soil. And yet, this destruction is the beginning of life. Without it, there is no tree, no growth, no fruit. Suffering is the breaking open of the shell, the cracking of the identity you thought was you. It is painful, yes, but what if it is also, and the mind says, this should not be happening, but the truth is, it is happening, and within it there is something for you. Some deeper strength, some wisdom, some awakening that only this moment can give you. The greatest souls this world has ever known have walked through suffering. They did not escape it. They walked through it and emerged on the other side, not bitter, not broken, but awake. But if suffering is not the end, what if it is the beginning? Suffering is not an enemy. It feels like one. It arrives uninvited, disrupts plans, and shakes the foundation of everything familiar. It takes away what we once held dear, comfort, certainty, identity. And yet, what if suffering is not here to harm you? The mind labels suffering as wrong. It resists, protests, clings to the idea that life should be different. But suffering is not an accident. It is not life punishing you. It is life calling you out of the illusion of control, out of attachment, out of the unconscious patterns that keep you asleep. Every great transformation is preceded by suffering, not because life is cruel, but because the old must dissolve for the new to emerge. A person who has never suffered deeply may live comfortably, but do they truly live? Or do they simply exist, wrapped in routine, avoiding discomfort, seeking temporary pleasures? Suffering interrupts this sleepwalking. It forces stillness. It removes distractions. It strips away the stories the mind tells itself about how things should be, and replaces them with a stark reality of what is. And within that reality, there is an opportunity to see life as it truly is, without illusion, without masks. Consider a man who loses everything. He once believed he was his job, his status, his possessions, and then, in a single moment, it all disappears. At first, he fights against it, consumed by anger and despair, but eventually, when there is nothing left to fight, he sits in silence. And in that silence, he sees something he never noticed before. Himself, not the identity he built, not the role he played, but something deeper, something untouched by loss. He realizes that who he is has nothing to do with what he owns. In losing everything, he has found himself. Suffering does not take away who you are. It reveals it. It exposes the false so that the truth can be seen. It is not your enemy. It is the doorway through which something greater can enter. The question is, will you walk through it? The mind resists suffering instinctively. It recoils, tightens, and fights against pain, convinced that it should not exist. This resistance creates a second layer of suffering, one that is often greater than the original pain itself. A moment of loss, rejection, or failure is painful, but it is the mind's refusal to accept it that turns it into unbearable suffering. The more you resist, the more suffering grows. Imagine a river flowing naturally. If you stand in the middle and fight against the current, exhaustion follows. The river does not change its course just because you resist, it continues flowing. Suffering is much the same. When we resist the inevitable, we suffer not just from the situation itself, but from the struggle against it. The moment we stop fighting the current, something shifts. There is still movement, still water flowing, but now we move with it rather than against it. There is an ease, even in the midst of difficulty. A person facing heartbreak, loss, or failure often asks, "Why is this happening to me?" This question fuels resistance, feeding the belief that suffering is an injustice rather than a part of life's unfolding. But suffering is not a mistake, it is not an interruption of life. It is life, revealing itself in a form that forces change. When we resist, we remain stuck. When we accept, we open the door to transformation. Consider someone who loses a loved one. The pain is deep, raw, and unavoidable. But beyond the pain, there is a choice. They can resist, dwelling in anger, regret, and denial, making suffering last indefinitely, or they can allow the grief to be what it is, an expression of love, a passage through pain, rather than a prison within it. This does not mean the pain disappears instantly, but when there is no resistance, suffering does not take over. The heart remains open, even in sorrow. And in that openness, healing begins. The greatest spiritual teachers, the most resilient souls, are not those who have never suffered, but those who have stopped resisting suffering. They do not escape pain, but they do not let it define them. When suffering is met with acceptance, it ceases to be suffering. It becomes something else entirely, a path, a teacher, a guide, leading beyond pain into something deeper, something unbreakable. Crisis has a way of tearing down everything false. It arrives suddenly, without warning, and leaves nothing untouched. The plans, the expectations, the sense of security, all of it can be gone in an instant. And in that moment, something becomes clear. Much of what we thought mattered never truly did. The small irritations, the endless worries, the things we chased without question, none of them hold weight anymore. When life shakes us to our core, what remains is only what is real. A man who has spent his life in pursuit of success suddenly loses everything, his job, his wealth, his reputation. In the silence that follows, he sees the truth. For years he believed he was these things. His worth was measured by what he had, by how others saw him. But now, stripped of it all, he faces a terrifying question. Who am I without all of this? The fear is overwhelming at first, but then something shifts. He begins to realize that he is still here. The loss did not erase him. And in that space of emptiness, a deeper truth arises. He was never his achievements, never his possessions. Beneath all of it, something unshakable has always been there. The crisis did not destroy him. A woman receives a diagnosis that changes everything. In an instant, the future she imagined disappears. At first, there is panic, grief, a desperate clinging to what was. But then something unexpected happens. She notices the way sunlight filters through the window, something she had never truly stopped to see before. She hears the laughter of a child in the distance and feels it deeply, as if for the first time. The touch of a loved one's hand carries a meaning she had never fully appreciated. Suddenly, life is not something distant, something to be chased in the future. It is here, it is now, and it is precious in a way she had never realized before. Crisis strips away illusion. It is the great revealer, showing us what has always been true but was hidden beneath distraction. It forces us to stop running, to face life directly, without the filters of expectation and assumption. What we once took for granted becomes sacred. What we once feared becomes our greatest teacher. And in that raw, exposed state, we do not find emptiness, we find life itself. Growth does not happen in comfort. It happens in the breaking, in the moments when everything we thought was solid begins to crumble. A seed does not grow by remaining whole. It must break open in the darkness of the soil. Without this breaking, there is no transformation, no tree, no fruit. Suffering feels like destruction, but what if it is not an end? What if it is the beginning of something greater? A man loses the life he built, a career, relationships, a future he was certain of. At first it feels like an unbearable loss. He clings to the past, trying to hold together what is already gone. But life does not move backward. As he lets go, something new begins to take shape. In the emptiness where his old identity once stood, he discovers a depth in himself he never knew existed. The loss that once felt like an ending becomes the very thing that opens the door to a life he never imagined. A woman who has lived in fear her entire life suddenly faces a moment where she has nothing left to lose. The fear that controlled her no longer holds power. In the space where fear once dictated her choices, courage is born. The suffering that once seemed unbearable becomes the fire that forges something unbreakable within her. Suffering forces transformation. It strips away what is false and leaves behind only what is real. It is painful, but pain is not the enemy. It is the force that shapes us, the pressure that cracks open what is small so that something greater can emerge. What feels like breaking is actually becoming. What feels like an ending is only the beginning. There is a silence that exists beneath suffering, but it is often unnoticed. The mind is too busy resisting, too consumed by the story of pain, loss, or injustice. It clings to the past, projects into the future, and fills every moment with noise. But suffering has a way of exhausting the mind. When all the fighting, blaming, and resisting wear thin, something unexpected happens. Stillness appears. A man facing overwhelming loss reaches a point where he can no longer struggle. His mind, exhausted from replaying the past and fearing the future, finally stops. And in that pause, he feels something he never expected. Peace. The situation has not changed, the loss is still there, but without resistance, without the mind turning it into a battle, there is space. Within that space there is presence, and within presence there is clarity. A woman drowning in grief walks outside, lost in sorrow. For weeks she has been consumed by pain, unable to see anything else. But as she walks, something pulls her attention, a single leaf falling from a tree. She watches it drift in the wind, spinning effortlessly, not resisting its descent. In that moment, something shifts. For the first time, she is not lost in thought. She is simply here. The suffering has not disappeared, but now it is surrounded by something vast, something unshaken by pain. Stillness does not remove suffering, but it transforms the way we experience it. It allows space for clarity, for a deeper intelligence to emerge. The mind believes that suffering must be fought, but in stillness we see the truth. Suffering is not an enemy, it is a wave passing through, and beneath it, the ocean remains untouched. Suffering feels like destruction, but what if it is transformation? The mind believes pain is something to escape, something to end as quickly as possible. But suffering is not here to break you, it is here to shape you. It burns away what is false revealing what is unshakable within you. It is not the end of you. It is the end of who you thought you were. A man betrayed by someone he trusted feels his entire world collapse. At first, the pain consumes him, filling every moment with anger and grief. He believes he has lost something essential, but as time passes, something deeper emerges. He realizes the pain is not destroying him, it is forcing him to grow. His suffering has made him see clearly who he was, who he thought others were, and what truly matters. The experience that once felt like an unbearable loss has instead given him a strength he never knew he had. A woman trapped in self-doubt and fear loses everything she depended on. She believes she is broken, too weak to endure. But in the face of loss, she has no choice but to stand. And when she does, she discovers something shocking. She is stronger than she ever imagined. The suffering did not destroy her, it revealed the power within her. Pain strips away illusion. It removes what is unnecessary and leaves only what is real. It is a teacher, a guide, not an enemy. When suffering is no longer seen as destruction, something shifts. It is no longer something to run from, but something to move through. And on the other side of suffering is something unexpected, not weakness, but power. The greatest souls in history did not rise despite suffering. They rose because of it. They did not escape hardship, they faced it, walked through it, and allowed it to transform them. Suffering was not their downfall, it was their awakening. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, stripped of his freedom, separated from his family, and surrounded by injustice. He could have let hatred consume him. He could have drowned in bitterness. But instead he used suffering as a forge, allowing it to shape him into a leader of extraordinary wisdom and compassion. The prison walls did not break him. They broke open something deeper within him, an unshakable spirit, a clarity that could not be taken away. When he finally walked free, he did not carry vengeance. He carried peace, and with it, he changed a nation. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, lost everything, his family, his home, the life he once knew. He witnessed unimaginable suffering, yet in the depths of despair he discovered something profound. While suffering is inevitable, how we respond to it is within our control. Even in a concentration camp stripped of all external freedom, he realized that his mind, his spirit, his ability to find meaning in suffering, these were his to command. He emerged from hell not broken but enlightened, teaching the world that meaning can be found even in the darkest moments. Suffering did not destroy these souls, it revealed their greatness. Their stories are not exceptions. The same potential lies within every person. Hardship is not a sign of weakness. It is the birthplace of strength. Those who embrace suffering as a teacher do not just survive, they transcend. And in their transcendence, they inspire the world. Suffering feels like an ending. It feels like life closing in, taking away what was once certain, leaving only pain and uncertainty. The mind believes that if suffering arises, something has gone wrong. But what if suffering is not the end? What if it is the beginning? Every moment of deep suffering carries a hidden choice. Resist and remain trapped in pain, or allow it to transform you. The mind wants to escape, to return to how things were, but life does not move backward. When suffering is met with openness instead of resistance, it becomes something entirely different. It becomes a threshold, a doorway into a deeper, more awakened existence. Some of the most powerful transformations come not from success, but from hardship. A heart broken by loss becomes more capable of love. A person who has fallen and risen again moves through life with wisdom and strength. The suffering that once seemed unbearable becomes the very thing that shapes a new way of being. Nothing is lost in suffering except illusion. What is real remains, and when the old falls away, something new is always waiting to emerge. The question is not why suffering happens, but who you become through it. Suffering is not the enemy. It is not a mistake, not a punishment, not a detour from life. It is life, unfolding in its most raw and transformative form. The mind resists it, fearing its intensity, but within suffering lies the very key to awakening. It strips away illusion, forces us to confront what is real, and reveals the strength, wisdom, and depth hidden within us. Every great soul has walked through suffering, not as victims, but as seekers, allowing pain to shape them rather than break them. Those who resist suffering remain trapped in its grip, but those who surrender to its lessons emerge transformed. Loss reveals what truly matters. Struggle builds resilience. Stillness within suffering leads to clarity. Pain cracks open the false self, making way for something deeper, something unshakable. The purpose of suffering is not to destroy, but to awaken. It is a fire that burns away the unnecessary, leaving only the essence of who we truly are. What feels like an end is often the beginning of something greater. And when suffering is no longer seen as an obstacle, but as a doorway, we step through, not weakened, but reborn.